Hi everyone, today is Wednesday, September 19th, and today's video is going to be about racial profiling, a definition. What is racial profiling? Racial profiling is a practice of prejudice. Racial profiling comes in so many different forms. For example, somebody could be walking down the street, somebody say, let's interrogate that person for whatever reason. And there's many different kinds of racial profiling. For example, people could be profiled by race because they may be driving a nice car. They could be walking down the street, wearing something. They could be even applying for a job, and for example, an interview, they could be racially profiled to a determination that says, you know what, we're not even going to give that person the job because for whatever things related to ignorance, prejudice, and just lack of education and compassion. So this racial profiling that I have spoken about on my channel is actually related to medicine. And within the black community, this is an incredibly disturbing trend. And not very many people come forward and speak about this because, number one, it's very humiliating. Number two, there may be some complexity around trying to understand the medical language, and really it's not something hard to understand. And three, there's no familiarity around some options. And just doing like a scan of, for example, responses to racial profiling, you see like a lot of these like articles in different newspapers, but you actually don't see anything related to policy change as well as new laws to say, okay, there's zero tolerance around racial profiling. So for some of you trying to understand what this thing called racial profiling is, the mere fact that you're actually questioning it is very good, but it's also indicative of the problem with the education system that actually doesn't talk about ways to address racial parity. If you look at, for example, in Canada's environment, the Indigenous or the First Nations people. First Nations is a problematic term because, for example, before the Indian Act, the First Nations never really considered themselves the First Nations there because they were the original inhabitants of the land. But after something called the Canadian Indian Act, there were certain practices that were actually imposed in that particular group where, for example, some persons from the Aboriginal community were still Aboriginal, and other persons from the Aboriginal community were no longer Aboriginal, and then there were persons who actually married into the culture that became Aboriginal according to this thing called the Canadian Indian Act, and that's just a form of assimilation and creating ethnic problems. So take some time to try and understand this thing called racial profiling. I've even had people, leave these messages and, call us niggers or whatever. But you know what? You still address that nigger out there. And you know what? Get to know what racial profiling is. It's an act of discrimination. And understand racial profiling by something called experiential data. Talk to people who have actually witnessed this, or talk to people who have actually experienced this. Talking to people who have actually experienced this is much better than people who have witnessed this. Although it's important for people who have witnessed this to also come forward and say, okay, you know what, we're actually going to, just write a letter to whomever to suggest that policy change needs to be done for certain reasons. So racial profiling is an act of discrimination and prejudice. And there should be no need for this in a society that considers itself civil and democratic. Thanks for watching.